This is Sophafil's Dark Season presents The Dead Famous, Episode 3, with Ronald Moger as James Montague, Jonah Richert as the voice of the press, Hazel Young as Helen Beeston and Sister Anna Patrick, and Colin Rance as Geoffrey Montague.
6. Mr. Michael Haywood, actor. 7. Miss Evelyn Moreau, actress. 8. Miss Joyce Caruthers, actress.
The first operation had been a failure, but no failure is complete unless lessons are ignored. I needed to retrace the whole evening's events in my mind and mentally deconstruct each moment. After some deliberation, only 2 items stood out as having been perhaps preventable, or in the very least, better planned for. The wandering geriatric and the non-existence of an actual coffin. More research was needed, and maybe even some sort of monitoring or scouting of each site would have to be carried out to ensure that not only would I be undisturbed in my work, but also that no one would discover my activities and report them to whatever authority they thought relevant. I returned to work at the newspaper, discreetly placed Barry's lock-picking kit back in his desk, and dwelled on the issue at hand while I half-heartedly reviewed a new romance-based film. These reviews were always simple enough to write, and I actually preferred to write them rather than any other when in a hurry, as it didn't actually require me to watch the film itself. Don't get me wrong, I adore films, but romantic films tend to fall into 2 separate descriptions of plot as follows. 1. Boy meets girl. Girl annoys boy. Girl hates boy. Boy and girl argue. Boy and girl share challenging experience that reveals previously hidden emotions. Boy and girl kiss. End credits. Or 2. Boy meets girl. Boy and girl love each other. Boy or girl gets sick or challenged in a way that renders the other helpless. Boy or girl loses boy or girl. Boy or girl triumphs through personal strength and adversity. End credits. To know which of these 2 types of film I was reviewing, I only had to look at the film poster. If the boy and girl were either looking at each other like, "You're annoying me," or "Get this guy," or they have their backs to each other while looking at the camera, it's the first type. If the poster features both parties laughing genuinely while looking downwards or avoiding looking straight into the camera, it's the second type. My assistant Louise was busy at her desk completing snap descriptions on some films that were due to be released that week. Having proved her worth by completing coherent and well-rounded articles in recent months, she was soon to be moved to slightly different duties. Our entertainment columns were expanding and now looked to include celebrity gossip and ill-founded Hollywood rumour. This area of writing embodied something that I wished to avoid, as I have never supported the world of what I perceive to be gutter journalism. Celebrities were to be adored from a distance. That was their strength. On the screen they can be faultless, so that we can project our insecurities and fears onto them. It makes us feel safe for a time, and we know that whatever happens, the good guy will always beat the bad guy, and the good guy's intentions are nothing but well-intentioned. Once their armour shows chinks, the image is destroyed along with their career. It's a bizarre irony that we go to see actors perform because we feel emotionally attached to them, and then people make the mistake of wanting to find out more beyond that persona. The more they know, the less it's like the character they see on screen. They can no longer associate with these people, and so their careers are destroyed because no one wants to see them anymore. Some things are perhaps best left in the darkness, never to be known. Once I had completed my review of the drab rom-com, I began planning my next operation with earnest. The target was to be Miss Evelyn Moreau, a busty starlet of the 50s. She had taken full advantage of her name's similarity to that of Marilyn Monroe, and as a result had enjoyed a short period of fame in the UK, starring opposite such names of the day as Dirk Bogarde and Leslie Phillips. As a film starlet, she had never actually enamoured herself to me, as she always portrayed the simpler female character, apparently only on screen as a visual rather than cerebral distraction. Once I was old enough to appreciate such things, I was always drawn to the more rounded of characters that encompassed all the possible charms of the on-screen leading lady. In reality, it was later revealed that Miss Moreau had been a member of Mensa with a proven IQ of 157. She was clever enough to know that her fame was to be short-lived, and so she finished her career in films early and moved into real estate management, investing her gained riches in numerous Belgravia properties. She threw herself into her work completely, and, due to her deprecated image of herself along with many other things, she never married. She sadly died of a heart attack in her Pimlico apartment at the respectable age of 79. Her body was found 2 weeks later, surrounded by her pet cats. I made full use of the facilities available to me at the office to find where Miss Moreau was buried. Some celebrities can be thankfully easy to trace, as there seems to be a cult attraction around where particular stars are buried, although it only seems to apply to some, and with seemingly little logic. It's well known that, for example, Oscar Wilde, Edith Piaf and Jim Morrison even are all buried in the sprawling Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, along with other noted companies such as Frédéric Chopin and Sarah Bernhardt. If one were to ask somebody, though, where John Lennon or Jimi Hendrix were buried, and you will find very few people know, if at all. In the case of Miss Moreau, it was a simple enough task, as even though she died alone, the relatives and journalists had come out in droves to offer their belated respects and show their mock sympathy. It was all over the papers, and her fans had continued to this day to leave flowers and notes in memoriam. I noted the address of the cemetery and started to plan my scouting trip as, unlike on the previous occasion, I'd decided to review the area and make proper plans rather than wasting my time and effort. As I was making these notes, I was distracted by the sound of crying from just outside of my office. Louise was at her desk and crying softly yet audibly into a tissue. I could never stand the sound of people crying. In my early teenage years at school, I excelled in most of my lessons and so became a target for bullying. My father did nothing about this, despite my letting him know on numerous occasions. I learned to resent him for that and made sure he would suffer in his life later as I had. Only one person seemed to understand my situation, and that was a fellow pupil called HelenColin. She also did well in her classes, but had the additional misfortune of coming from a single-parent family, and, as money was short, her mother could only afford to clothe her in the cheapest labels and furnish her with the most dreadful spectacles that the NHS could offer. Boys can be violent, but mainly they're just an irritant. Girls, however, can be extremely cruel and will target what they perceive to be the weak or any form of competition and set about destroying it. Helen and I spent many happy days reading books together and fantasizing about imaginary lands and worlds where we would be adventurers, royalty, super-strength athletes. If I had ever known love in my life, then this was surely the closest I'd come to it. There was never anything that anyone could do to destroy our friendship, and we were convinced that we would be friends for all time, move to the countryside, and get away from the bullies and troubles from school. One year, after our summer holidays had ended, Helen was called out of class by the school secretary and told that her mother had passed away. Finding herself an orphan, I suppose she threw herself more and more into a fantasy world to cushion the blow of her loss that she was ill prepared to either accept or deal with. After she'd taken a fortnight away from school to move in with relatives, she returned, but something was missing. I no longer recognised the friend I'd previously known. The sparkle from her eyes had somehow been extinguished, and she drifted through classes like a ghost. The bullying continued, of course, and I remember on one particularly fateful day, I saw her sitting alone and crying in the school field. I had no idea what I should say, if I should help. Helen, as I knew her, had died along with her mother, and I didn't know how to provide any form of comfort to the situation. Her troubles wouldn't end. I couldn't bring her family back to her, so I walked away, and I never spoke to her again. The time I now spent alone at school was thrown into my old hobby of reading about celebrities, ever smiling in their photographs, always happy to see their adoring public. There were no tears on the red carpet. I threw myself with gusto into my hobby that my friendship with Helen had distracted from temporarily, and I never looked back. Helen was no more a part of my life than anyone else I met, and her future laid elsewhere. Louise's crying brought all this flooding back to me. A small wave of ice-cold familiarity flooded over me for a brief second. The image of Helen alone in that field, the magazine that brought me comfort in the years afterwards. Looking at Louise at her desk, it was all too familiar. I picked up a chocolate bar, rose from my desk, and shut my office door to block out the hideous din. The chocolate bar would help me concentrate, and the last thing I needed was the sound of her grizzling to distract me from my work. The cemetery itself was large enough, but was sectioned out with simpler graves on one side, huddled tightly away from the more lavish of those who could afford it on the other. People separated by money and class as they'd been in life. The photographs that appeared at the time of her funeral showed quite clearly the larger monuments either side of her recently prepared grave, which wouldn't have a memorial of its own until the earth had settled down somewhat. I appreciated the irony that these richer graves with their adornments and over-the-top mausoleums, designed to keep their inhabitants underground in perceived comfort, were now helping me so much in identifying them and making sure they were raised out of their graves. I was nothing less than grateful. The surrounding grander graves would help with reducing the possibility of being caught at the scene, but I was concerned at the very real and potentially dangerous prospect of the foundations of those mausoleums giving way and collapsing upon me as I dug away at the surface. The grave cover idea that I'd partly concocted was slowly beginning to take shape in my head. It wouldn't give me cover while digging, I realised that, but it would buy me time by covering the grave in between digging shifts, as it would have been far too tiring and risky to attempt to excavate an entire grave in one single attempt. To clear away the soil was a slightly trickier issue. I considered a number of different approaches, and the same considerations arose each and every time. The soil itself would have to remain close to the grave, as it would take far too long to transport it anywhere else, and to do so would increase the risk of being caught. The solution I settled upon, albeit an arbitrary one, was to lay the soil behind the grave itself and cover it, first with a sheet of fake grass, and then scattered with dead leaves. It was now September, and the sight of such a pile would not draw attention or indeed look out of place. I obtained the grass sheet simply enough. On a visit to a local greengrocer's, I saw a suitably sized example under a long display of freshly farmed carrots and Savoy cabbages. A young lad stood nearby, shopping with his mother. While she was busying herself with the tangerines, a spotted youth behind the cash register was ever so badly pretending not to gawp as he looked down her cleavage. As he wandered inanely past the display, I asked him to pass me the larger of the cabbages right at the bottom, and as soon as he'd removed it, the entirety of the produce came chaotically rumbling and tumbling to the floor. The mother and the spotted youth scrambled to pick up the quickly spreading vegetables, and while they were distracted, I whipped the grass sheeting from the display table, folded it quickly and discreetly under my coat, and made good my escape from the scene. The rest of the covering's construction was a less troublesome affair. This required only a visit to the hardware store to purchase some medium density fibreboard with dimensions of approximately 4 foot by 8 feet. On taking this home, I cut the board into smaller, equal pieces. I fit hinges onto strategic edges and constructed the whole thing to slot neatly into a shoulder bag. The hinges enabled it to be folded in a manner not dissimilar to a board for a general knowledge game. In order to stop one edge rising up and to hold it in place, I fitted a simple hook and eye. My plan would be to lay the board over the grave of choice, fix the grass matting with pins into the board, and then scatter real grass and leaves upon it so as not to draw attention. A few stones here and there to stop the effects of the wind that the pins could not cope with, and all was done. The whole kit took a few hours to construct, but it was time well spent. By the time I was finished, I had a moment to reward myself with a cup of tea and got ready to set off into the night for my next rendezvous. It's a cliché of particular types of cheaper fiction to set the mood of a setting or environment before going on to explain the actions of the event. But clichés exist because of constant use, and who am I to buck trends in this respect? I left home on a dark autumnal evening. There was a mild wind that whipped up leaves from the gutter and blew them along by my feet as I paced hurriedly yet assertively towards my destination. There was a mild chill in the air, but my scarf, warmly wrapped around me, kept out the worst of the elements. The cemetery itself was approximately 2 miles from my house, and despite the weight of my tool bag slowing my pace, I arrived there in good time and with enough breath and vigour in my body to scale the wall and to land behind a copse of trees in one of the more darkened and secluded areas of the grounds. The bright full moon helping to guide my way, I found a grave soon enough and set to work digging at the topsoil. As always, the schedule was frustratingly tight. I'd allowed myself 2.5 hours of working time as I'd wanted to limit the chances of being spotted by anyone nearby. Any earlier, and the alcoholics and wastrels leaving the local late night bars would have spotted me, and any time after around 4:30 in the morning would have exposed me to milkmen, early delivery vans and the like. Just as the moon was no longer able to light my work for me, the first night's work was complete. I hurriedly tidied away the soil and turf, hiding it as planned, and then folded out my grave covering to weigh it down and disguise it before making good my escape and heading home. I had an hour's sleep before getting up, refreshing myself as best I could, with a shower, and then heading to the office for another day's mindless and predictable drudgery behind my desk. The hours dragged by in agony. I was split between the anticipation of getting back to complete the excavation and the worry that someone might somehow uncover my deed while I was at work. I considered this unlikely, realising from my sweating and now shaking hands that I'd perhaps gone overboard with my coffee intake and decided to distract my mind with other things. At midday, I was preparing to leave the office briefly to fetch a sandwich from a nearby baker's when the editor came to my room and asked if I'd seen or heard from Louise that morning. I'd been completely oblivious to her absence. Louise had apparently not been in all day. I have to confess that since my hobby had picked up more speed, I'd found less time for my previous half-hearted chats with her and became almost indifferent to her presence as long as the work was being completed adequately and on time. Besides those specific facts of this particular work relationship, I found that work colleagues are more of a means to an end. I have my task to complete, they have theirs. Sometimes those paths will cross and rely on each other, sometimes they won't. I see and have not seen any reason to somehow feel obligated to socialise, develop friendships, or even feel emotion towards these people purely because of those interactions. My editor apparently felt differently. He was very hands-on with these cases and usually visited staff himself as he wanted to keep us working. Today, however, was a day of meetings for him, and so I was sent to her address instead to check that all was well, and the sandwich would have to wait.
No personal items were missing from the scene. Police are appealing for anyone who might have been in the vicinity of the Woods Row Cemetery between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. on the night of...
Louise had a doorbell that could make the sturdiest of ears think about vomiting. Until the UK authorities saw sense and banned multi-toned car horns from privately owned vehicles, a number of drivers found self-congratulating hilarity in having some of the most obnoxious sounds emanating from their bonnets that you can imagine from a limited selection of notes. The most boringly obvious of these was La Cucaracha. For me, this simply declared the driver's lack of personality, disregard for how many people would be irritated in one toot of this godforsaken horn, and how little he had blessed this individual in the brain, and most likely in the trouser department. This tune was also Louise's doorbell chime. If my finger could have shuddered after pressing the bell, it would have. She answered the door wrapped in an oversized pink dressing gown, clutching a tissue, and having the puffed yet pallid facial features that only a night of crying can give you. She invited me in for a cup of tea. As the kettle boiled, I could think of nothing immediately to say to her, and so inquired about the nature of the doorbell. The apartment, she said, had originally been rented by her boyfriend alone. He'd always had a love of 1970s supercharged cars, but had never had the money to obtain one of his own. The doorbell was his minor attempt of coming close to this world that he would never physically know. Once Louise and he had met and they moved in together, things were fine for the first year or so. Babies were planned. Wedding preparations were soon being discussed. People started visiting from Louise's family to help on advice towards these future preparations. Little did Louise know that this constant influx of visitors and the vulgar doorbell noise accompanying their arrival only came to make him realise not only did he not want to get married, but he most definitely needed that beast of a supercharger with the La Cucaracha horn. Soon enough, he fled and, taking all the wedding savings with him, bought a 1972 Ford Mustang Mach 1. On leaving, he declared his total love for the open road and, unfortunately, none for Louise. Louise was left to clear up the trail of desolation he left behind. This had come to a head a few days before, and was the reason why she had been crying that previous morning at work. I'd done my best to ignore her, and by all accounts succeeded until now. The rental cost of the apartment, plus the cost of all bills associated with it, meant that her financial situation had become dire. I had neither the power at the office to obtain any sort of raise in her salary for her, nor the personal resources to lend her any money of my own. I drank my tea and returned to the office with a bitter taste in my mouth, although that might have been the out-of-date milk that she'd apparently used. The rest of my day passed by with its predictable banality. I let the editor know of Louise's situation and left him to decide his next steps in the case. It was neither my responsibility nor my duty to do anything about it. I did have a nagging thought in my head for a brief moment, but it soon passed. There were other issues more demanding and deserving of my attention. On returning to the cemetery that night, I continued my work with an extra distraction eating away at my head like a worm to an apple. The funeral of Sylvia Moore had been a private affair, and apart from my presence, no other publications had cared enough to send anyone to cover the story. This meant there had been no one to report on the scene of disarray that I might have left behind as I'd fled the church that day. It had been some time now, though, and some rumours had indeed leaked out regarding some level of upset which now reached the office. Journalists are by nature very good at sniffing out such things. As far as our editor was concerned, it had been a potentially good story, and we'd failed to either be aware of it or report on it. It was good fortune that no other paper had spotted it either, and so it limited his frustration, but I knew I would have to answer for it at some point. Going through this in my head, I finished my digging for the night and made my way home to a few hours of low-quality sleep. Upon my arrival at work the next morning, I'd barely taken off my coat when I was asked to enter the editor's office. Closing the door behind me, I was asked to explain what happened on the day of the funeral. I stated I had taken the photos that I thought were needed and left the church before any ceremony had taken place, the events of which I've heard whispers, if they'd happened at all, took place after my leaving. He was annoyed at the loss of a good story and let me know in no uncertain terms that it was my leaving the scene that had cost me that article. He added that it was only my record as a productive and reliable journalist that had saved me from any form of warning, and sent me on my way. This man, who had until now played only a background role in my career, now suddenly decided to berate me for something that could only be fixed with the benefit of hindsight. As I walked to my desk, Barry the bin man gave me a snide look across his computer monitor. I was sure that he had been the root of these rumours, but would have to let it go. There's no more imbecilic way of admitting suspected guilt than by rising to the goads of a moron. I closed my office door, wrote a half-hearted piece on a new film studio, and then made my excuses to leave early for home. There were other things to be dealt with. After eating a late supper, I gathered my kit and headed out into the night. I seemed to arrive at my destination a lot quicker than on my previous evenings, and the wall seemed no effort at all to scale. I was riding on adrenaline and the realisation that I would soon have another photograph in my collection. And soon enough my shovel hit the wooded lid of Evelyn Moreau's coffin. A cold sweat started to form on my brow as I dropped to my knees to scramble away the last clumps of soil from around the edges, and, lodging my feet in the grave walls above, I jammed my crowbar into the coffin's side. Each lever resulted in an unwelcome loud crack, and each crack had made me pause, look around the cemetery, and then continue my work. Each pause had increased my sweating, but my breathing remained calm. The lid opened. Evelyn had clearly been dead for some time, but her beauty had not diminished. Her silver locks flowed from her head, and the dress she'd been buried in was every inch as glamorous as she had been in life. Getting my camera, I raised her up steadily, put my arm around her, and, failing to hide my bliss at the occasion, smiled pleasantly for the camera. A sense of achievement washed over me as I laid her back down, closed the lid, and climbed out of the dank pit. Due to additional planning, the filling in of the grave was less of a task than the initial digging had proved to be. I had a roll of synthetic foam which I rolled out, laid on top of the coffin, and as I pushed the soil back into the grave, the foam cushioned the noise to a good level. I did not have the time to make a perfect job of it though, and completed this task as quickly as possible, covering the grave with grass ripped by hand from the surrounding area, and then adding leaves to help camouflage evidence of any work further. I left the scene and walked with speedy determination back home. There was no patience left within me, and was on too much of a rush for trying to get what I considered to be unnecessary sleep. The photo would be developed immediately. Clipping up the dripping images to dry, I made some tea to pass the time, and retrieved my 30 Famous Faces supplement. It had been so long since I'd been able to open the pages with any intention other than to torture myself with lost causes, but these were lost causes no more. I turned to Evelyn's page and, taking not a pencil with its implied temporary use, but a black marker pen, slowly drew a satisfyingly thick black circle around her image, and I took a mouthful of tea and relaxed back into my armchair, where a glowing warmness came over me. It was divine.
Dear Mr. Montague, it is with deep regret that I should have to contact you under such sad circumstances. Further to the death of your father at St Mary and Joseph's, we were unable to contact you by telephone to organise the collection of your father's personal effects. As is unfortunately normal in these situations, we have had to make his room available for new residents, and so we have packed his belongings into storage, which we will hold at the home for a period of 2 months for you to collect. If you do not wish to collect these items, we will donate them to the other residents or, if you prefer, a charity of your choosing. We do not need to remind you that your father was an incredibly popular man at the home, and his presence here will be sorely missed. I look forward to hearing from you in due course to discuss any arrangements further. Yours sincerely, Sister Anna Patrick.
Next week, James heads out on a road trip, but doesn't make allowances for the local wildlife. New episodes are released to all streaming services every Wednesday. Subscribe now to get notified on its release. All music is by Shane Ivers of Silverman Sound. The Dead Famous was written and produced by Ronald Moger. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at This Is Sophaville.